for the people who have no clue of what this is, in the most layman's terms, let's explain it to those producers and engineers who definitely would be interested in this.
Yeah, it's good. We should get that out of the way. So Access Analog takes a lot of the rack mount gear that you would find in a music studio, that 1176s or LA2As or any of this type of rack mount hardware that we use for music production and other stuff as well. That gear, we put it in at our location. That's what's behind me. And then we put a bunch of robotics on the front of it to control it. And then we give you, the customer, a plugin. And the plugin doesn't do anything other than stream audio across the internet and through this gear and back to you. So it performs like a plugin, it behaves like a plugin, and it's familiar like that. But when you're turning the software knob in the plugin, you're turning the physical knob in real time of this gear. And so you essentially have remote control of all of this gear, and you can chain it together or, make presets like we were talking about earlier. And ultimately you can use the gear. And then when you're done kind of at the end of your session of using the gear, you can bounce the result and you walk away with processed audio with real analog gear. And you can, import that in your DAW or whatever.
Yeah. And I see that being, obviously incredibly helpful, especially with the home studio, boom of the last, we'll say 5 to 7 years, right? Like the explosion of home studios, and like most producers that used to rent out these massive studios now moving into their own spaces, maybe in their house or in like a compound with a bunch of other producers. And so they may not necessarily have access to a massive passive, right? Like a manly massive passive that might be a part of their master bus. I know that's a pretty common one on their 2 bus, right? So, or maybe they don't have their Avalon or, what have you, these weird niche specific pieces of gear that a lot of people build their careers on their vocal chain, and maybe they don't have access to that anymore. They just can't afford it. Or it was like a one of one in that room, like it's a less easily accessible piece of gear now that you guys have the accessibility to through the internet, and they can continue to use that like it never even left.
Yeah, definitely. Ease of access is one of the huge benefits. Even people that own the gear, kind of want to be able to access their gear from more than one location.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get requests for people that are like, can you just do that to my gear and then make it to where I can use it from anywhere? And the answer is, yeah, we can, but it's kind of all a custom job. And,
sure.
And so we haven't figured out how to make that economically viable, but but it's kind of a side thing and those people also want to be able to have presets. So even people that go out and buy this expensive gear, they don't have the benefit of presets that we have, and recall as well. So when you open your DAW session and you were using the plugin before with a massive passive, when you open that massive passive again in the DAW, it goes back to the settings that you had it before.
Yeah.
And you can continue from there. So a lot of good major benefits. Obviously the one thing we don't have is the tactile feel of the knobs. You don't get that through our service, but we think you get everything else.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. And so, and you're using robotic arms and knob, like you're using pieces of robotic gear essentially that's placed on every aspect of the faceplate to then, that is what, when they are turning, the threshold, it is corresponding to the threshold motor on that gear and then turning that threshold knob accordingly.
That's correct. We have motors on every knob. We have these solenoids on the buttons, and we have motors on on switches. So that kind of narrows down the types of controls that exist on this equipment. It's knobs, buttons, and switches. And so we tackled those three, and we have the robotics, as you can see here in the background. Like all these tiny rectangular things are motors. In fact, this is, well, I'm not sure what piece that is, but I think that's part of Brian Lucy's Magic Garden rig, which we'll talk about some of the mastering changes we have.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we put the robotics on there so that every control that's on the real device, this is what we aspire to. We want you to have control of that, unless it makes completely no sense. Like if it's a switch for a side chain, an external side chain that we don't have hooked up, then we won't put that switch, we won't control that switch. And then another corollary to this is that there's the meters on the equipment, and we want you to be able to have the real, as much of the real meter as you can. And so what we've done is put cameras on the meters, and we track the meters, and we relay that tracking to the plugins. So the meter you're seeing in the plugin, the movement is tracked from the real equipment, so you're getting the real meter.
That's incredibly impressive. I actually did not even realize that whenever I was like watching videos about this and stuff. I didn't, in my mind, it was just like an input thing, or like, it was like a feed based off of whatever was happening. It wasn't necessarily like a real time camera, like based on what the meter is actually doing in the unit.
Yeah. We tried it. That was one thing we really wanted to do, is have no simulation in any of this. This is where you go to get real hardware, not any type of emulation. So we wanted to stay true to that principle. And then the other thing was that we didn't want to open the unit up. We didn't want to alter the unit in any way, which led us down the path of doing robotics. And it's the only way to be on the outside of the unit and provide control. And so that's kind of
without changing any of the internal infrastructure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually, because and especially when you start getting into like a lot of older pieces or more vintage, like it's very specific pieces, like you start messing with internals that can drastically change every aspect to what happens to the audio as it passes through everything.
Yeah, it all interacts.
Yeah.
So you can see where if you tried to change one piece in there in order to be able to control it, you end up changing the whole subsystem. So we just wanted to stay out of the box.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly impressive. Well, it's also impressive that you were able to do it. And like, as I look through just the things that you offer, another place that this is like very, very cool for is, we talk a lot about, on the podcast, we've talked a lot about like people getting hands-on experience with a lot of rat gear. And I know that's not always possible, but I like to tell people it's good to have hands-on experience with rat gear, like the real pieces that you use plug-in versions of, because you need to know how that real unit reacts to an incoming source of audio, whether it's a vocal or a drum bus or master bus or whatever. Like having that, and understanding that initial thing can then like help you make better decisions, whether you're using a plug-in version or you're going to another room and you use a real version of that. So you've now made that accessible to the people that are kind of coming up, that a lot of people aren't going to have the opportunity to go to. Like I learned in a large format studio. I learned on a large format console, an SSL 9000J, with a room that was full of rat gear, and I had the ability to just plug and play at my heart's content. I recognize that I am very lucky, and very few people get that opportunity, especially when you're like in the middle of the country where there are a lot less large studios, and you're not on one of the coasts where a lot of the music happens. Nashville, Atlanta, New York.
Yeah, or worse yet, you're international. Some countries, do have access to this equipment, but there's quite a few where essentially what they say is, as expensive as we think this equipment is, it's even more expensive to have to import it to a different country. So.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. That's a very good insight. And yeah, and you guys are, because you're online based, you're international, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So you've opened up the rest of the world to being able to use some of this, like we've been saying massive passive, but that's a very sought after piece of gear. A lot of people like that EQ, like that's a very good example of a piece of gear that not a lot of people will ever be able to actually touch, because it is on the upper echelon of, nice pieces of gear.
Yeah.
But now you've
Yeah.
instantly made it accessible for, I think that one's 1174 for 30 minutes. So like, 22, 23 bucks for an hour with it to pass as much as you want through and mess around with it and see how it works and see.
Yeah, and we have subscriptions where you could get a subscription to that device or a set of 2 or 3 year devices or whatever, and then the value goes up even more on the subscription. And then the other
Yeah.
thing that's kind of fun to talk about, the use case of someone who is thinking about buying a massive passive, and they need to hear it. They need to hear it on their own system, figure out how to use it, and kind of go, yeah, I really love this device. I'm going to go buy this. So
Yeah, and they
we're
don't
happy
live
to
near
assist.
Vintage King
Yeah,
or Sweetwater or some of these larger places. And because those are, I mean, of a place that would actually have something like a massive passive or at that level, you're talking
right.
maybe 5 or 6 places in the country that aren't studios.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. And even if you did, going into Vintage King and in their showroom and trying to make a decision there is a lot harder than in your own studio
Yeah.
where you're going to be using the device. So we love to try to help facilitate. We think all of these manufacturers are super awesome and we want to support them. And, we're happy to facilitate that. We call it try before buy.